Hey everyone, welcome to another prehab moto. Today we're going to talk about the elbow joint, the wrist joint, and also the hand, as these parts of the bodies operate together in pronation, supination, flexion, extension at both the elbow and the wrist, and circumduction at the wrist. So a lot of different movements going on. Also a lot of bones to work with, all the way from the upper arm bone down into our fingertips. So let's get into it a little bit. Starting off, not pictured behind me, is the humerus bone, which is the upper arm bone, so the upper part of the elbow. Then we get into the lower arm, which is going to be our radius and ulna. So those two bones make up our forearm in length here. So the ulna is going to be the bone that sits on the bottom. It has a little bit more of a curve to it, while the radius is on top. It's also a little bit bigger. So kind of similar to the same situation as the legs, as we have the femur on top, and we have the tibia and the fib at the bottom, and the tib being the bigger bone of the two. So basically the radius is the bigger bone of the two up here, with the radius and the ulna. Getting into the hand, it gets a little bit more complicated because there's a lot of different bones going on there. So we're going to start proximally and go distally, or we're going to start from the wrist and go down to the fingertips. So we have a combination of 8 different cuboid bones that sit right here in the hand that make up our mid hand, and also we can kind of feel those if you just kind of press in there. So those bones don't have a lot of blood flow to them. So if they actually become injured, which is not an uncommon thing to happen in sport, especially like an impact, it's very common to break the scaphoid, which is the biggest bone, and it's also known as a boxer's fracture, because so this is a left hand here. So the scaphoid is number 3 here, which sits right below in that thumb. So it's a pretty big bone, and it doesn't have a ton of circulation to it, but it can recover fairly well. Sometimes doesn't need surgery, but a lot of times it does. But we'll go in order here. So going off of the index finger here, we have the trapezoid bone, which is the cuboids, the trapezium bone. Then we get to that scaphoid, which is 3. So we got 1, 2, 3. We're going to go to 4, which is the dead middle right there, which is called the capitate. Then we go down middle, and we get the lunate. And then if we move back up to the top on the left here of this left hand, then we're going to get into the hamate. And then we get into the outermost one towards the pinky on top, which is the pisiform. And then the triquetrum, which sits right underneath. That's a mouthful to say. I had to practice to say that. I had to do it in college too. Triquetrum is a hard one to say sometimes. So triquetrum is the last one there. So those are the 8 bones that make up the cuboids of the hand. Then we start getting into a little bit more of the length of the hand rather than just this lower part, which we have the metacarpals, which we have 5 metacarpals. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across from pinky to thumb. Then we get into the phalanges, which if we look at that right here, P-H-A-L-A-N-X, doesn't really look like it spells phalanges, but that's what we call them there. So the phalanges, which we have a proximal, a middle, and a distal phalange for these 4 fingers of our digits, but our thumb only has a proximal and a distal. Meanwhile, those 4 have the middle, distal, and proximal. So we have 5 proximal phalanges, being these ones here. Boom, 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 boom. Then we have 4 middle phalanges, being just on these 4 digits. And then we have 5 distal phalanges, being all the way across to the thumb. So it's pretty easy to tell that the thumb, looking at the joint of our index finger to the joint of the thumb, there is a joint missing in there, or a bone missing in there, which makes up the difference in the anatomy of that thumb to the other fingers or the phalanges there. So a lot of bones going on there, right? So like I said, there's 8 cuboids. So we got 8, 5 metacarpals, 13, 5 proximal phalanges, so 18, 4 middle phalanges, 22, and then 5 more distal phalanges, 27. Okay, so I talked about this with the feet. There's a lot of bones in the hands and the feet, and when we have 206 total bones throughout our whole body, and 27 of them alone sit in one hand, our feet and our hands basically make up half of our bones in our body, because if you think about a lot of the length that we're dealing with, 1, 2, 3, that makes up most of the length of my arm. 1, 2, 3, 4 makes up the length of my leg, with the kneecap being added in there. So we really think about the body, we gotta remember most of our bones sit in these regions of our hands and our feet. Very cool, very complicated a little bit, but really neat. As it goes for motocross, this is one of the biggest things that we have contact with the bike with. Yes, our feet sit on the pegs and our knees squeeze the bike, but our hands are the only things that are actually gripping in contact with the bike. And thankfully, we have all those bones and joints so that we can articulate what we're trying to do in our hands and have that different movements and everything, so that we can move around in the wrist as well as those bones in the hand. So the wrist joint, as you can see, it actually is a pretty simple joint because those cuboids sit nice with the long bones in the ulna and the radius. So getting into the musculature a little bit, I don't have this drawn behind me, so don't worry about it. I'm going to use myself here. Starting the upper arm, of course, we have the tricep, which is an elbow extensor muscle, so there's tricep 3. We have the bicep, which is 2 muscles, which is an elbow flexor. However, there actually is a brachialis muscle that sits underneath the bicep that gets no love whatsoever. So the brachialis muscle, if we remove the bicep, which makes up more of the superficial portion of our inside of our arm, we get into the brachialis, which actually can have the potential of generating 50% more power than even the bicep muscle itself. So with that being said, getting that muscle underneath stronger is actually what helps us a lot more with elbow flexion, but we give a lot of credit to the more the superficial looking muscle of that bicep. Moving down into this region, tons of muscles. There's a lot of stuff going on in the forearms with the radius and ulna. And the muscles in the forearms are actually most of the muscles that control how the wrist and also these fingers move. Yes, there's a ton of muscles in the hands as well, but that can get a little bit complicated for a 101 series. Getting into some of these muscles though, we do have the extensor carpi radialis longus, which is gonna be on the radial side, not the ulnar side. So it's an extensor muscle, of course. We have the brachialis radialis, which is actually this muscle right here, as we can see on my arm. That muscle helps with elbow flexion a little bit and also wrist extension. So it's kind of a 2-for-1. And when we're talking about our hands being pronated, so pronated is hands over top like such, supinated would be underneath, which we'll get into a couple muscles there. But when our hands are pronated, we actually have a big activation of that muscle there. So this is a strong muscle to have for riding, because especially on throttle side, if we're twisting throttle, you can see that muscle is very active in my arm as I'm turning right there. So we can see that coming across, we can see it poking out right there. So specifically, there's gonna be some workouts that we can do to help that muscle become a little bit stronger, have a little more endurance to it, of course. Extensor digitorums, these muscles, once again, another extensor on top, so helps with wrist extension, but also can help with pulling the fingers upwards, because they do run into the hands, and you can actually see the tendons if you open your hands up and see those tendons that run through to the digits there. Then we get into supinator and pronator. So I talked about supination and pronation. So we actually have little muscles up here that help us with that. So there's a supinator muscle and there's also a pronator muscle that help to rotate that forearm, which is a very unique component that our forearm is capable of doing that. Even though the knee is also a hinge joint like the elbow, the knee doesn't have that capability because it's a different setup. But with that being said, these muscles are very important to work in translation with our arms to help gain strength, but also to increase blood flow and such things like that. We go into the flexor side, which is going to be the inside. Okay, so extensor side, extending the wrist. Flexor side is going to flex the wrist here. Okay, so if we're getting into those, we have the flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnar, and then also the flexor digitorum superficialis and the flexor digitorum profundus. Okay, so don't worry about trying to remember those names. Like I said, there's a ton of muscles in the forearms that basically are going to cause flexion of the wrist, closing of the hands, extension of the wrist, and opening of the hands and stuff like that. Okay, so it's a very complex system, a little bit more complex than the shin, being the gastroc and the soleus that sit down on the back side of the shin, and then the tibialis anterior that sits on the front side of the shin. A little bit more straightforward when it comes to the legs. But there's a lot more movement going on here, and when there's more movement to an area, it's gonna have more musculature to create those movements. We also get into the hand. We have really big muscles in the hands. And we also have that sheath that a lot of people might be familiar with, being carpal tunnel syndrome, that people can develop. And the sheath is a little bit more connective tissue rather than musculature. So you can think of connective tissue more like saran wrap material. It has a little pliability to it, but not very much. So connective tissue is your fascia, your tendons, your ligaments, and then also just connective tissue in general. So that extensor in here gets really tight and can cause a pinching of the nerves going into the hands, and then we can look at things like carpal tunnel syndrome with that. Of course, there are procedures to release that pressure, very small incision if it's going to be orthoscopic, and release the pressure. I've seen athletes have very good success with that and allow them to actually get a lot more feeling back in their hands. Don't associate carpal tunnel syndrome necessarily with arm pump. They could exist together, but they also might not be the same thing. So don't kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater there. Getting in here, we have an adductor of the thumb, adductor, which is going to pull inwards, abductor, which is going to pull outwards, and then also a flexor of that as well. So that's an important muscle, because when we're talking about wrapping our thumbs around a handlebar or even a bar or whatever it is in general, we can see how we have these motions in the thumbs that allows us to adduct, abduct, and flex up and down, adduct, and then flex in. That also helps to create a lot of strength. If you go hold on to bars or even try and ride your dirt bike without your thumbs, yes, you're capable of doing so, but your thumbs and those three muscles are very important to help solidify the grip on the bike. So a lot of anatomy there, because we're covering 3 different parts of the body, but we're gonna look at 5 different exercises that can help all 3 parts of these, since the body kind of works all together in this region. So we'll break that down and we'll look at it later.